Today's sermon is titled Touchstones, to be delivered by Reverend Ken Reed Brown. Reverend Ken Reed Brown has been the minister of First Parish in Hingham Old Ship Church, Unitarian Universalist, since 1987. Prior to his settlement, Ken served as Associate Director of Cambridge Forum and Assistant Minister at First Parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ken was born and raised on Long Island, New York. He's a graduate of Haverford College, from which he received a BA in philosophy, and of Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California, from which he received a Master's of Divinity degree. Before entering Starr King, Ken taught music at a school for severely learning disabled children. He lives in Hingham with his wife, Susan. They have 3 grown children and 4 grandchildren. Ken will be retiring as of July 31st, 2022. Ken, please welcome Ken.
Thank you, Dolores. Thanks very much. Once again, really good to be with you all. I'm going to play with my screen here. There we go. So the sermon is Touchstones. Touchstones. Before I begin formally, I want to acknowledge the week that we've just lived through, really the 2 weeks of tragic shootings and, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine. These are challenging times, and to say the least. I believe this theme of touchstones, we always need touchstones to keep us balanced, if you will, and so I hope that my words this morning will be healing and helpful during these times, especially. So what is a touchstone? For the last several years, I've used the word for myself to describe those passages and quotes, things I've read, whether ancient or modern words, that I have found myself returning to over and over again, over years, decades in some cases. These are passages or words that have been grounding to me, or inspiring or healing, words that in one way or another have been helpful companions in my life journey and in my ministry. More technically, the word touchstone, I finally looked it up once, is a dark-colored stone of some sort. It could be slate or a field stone that's used to test a precious metal, be it gold or silver. Metaphorically, Wikipedia, that source of all wisdom, tells us that a touchstone refers to any physical or intellectual measure by which the validity or merit of a concept can be tested. So following the metaphor, the touchstone is not itself the precious metal, when understood literally, nor is it itself the concept, when understood metaphorically. So when it comes not to geology but to life, I suppose the precious metal is the truth which may often be beyond words. One of my touchstone passages or lines comes from the opening of the Tao Te Ching. Some of you may be familiar with it. Begins that the Tao, the way, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, beyond words. Now, in this morning's reading, the second reading from Henry David Thoreau's Walden, we heard one of my touchstone passages. Maybe it's been a touchstone passage for some of you. Read a long time ago. The guy was only 30 years old when he wrote these words, but they have wisdom beyond his age. After all, Jesus was only in his 30s. Buddha was only in his 30s or less, younger when he was so-called enlightened. In any case, these lines from where I lived and what I lived for began, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach. And not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. So it seems to me that Thoreau was saying that his 2 years by Walden Pond, that's how most of us know him. He was a guy who lived by Walden Pond. He was only there for 2 years. But they were intended for him to be a touchstone for his living, a place and a time to test, so to speak, as he said in that reading, to test the meaning of life. My father, a surgeon who also was fond of Thoreau and Walden, said on a number of occasions that for him it was the operating room that was his Walden, if you will. He went into medicine and then eventually surgery because he thought that he might learn something about life in the midst of it, and he knew he would be doing something worth doing, something valuable for others. For me, it has been here in this meeting house, here as minister of Old Ship Church for half of my life, these last 35 years. This has been my Walden for the last 35 years. Quite a different setting amidst a full life of a congregation than Thoreau's cabin by the pond. He had one chair for solitude, he said, two chairs for two for company and three for society. So we think of Thoreau as a hermit, but he wasn't. He wanted to live a life of simplicity amidst an outward civilization. And in fact, he had lots of visitors. People were curious. He had lots of visitors while he was at the cabin, and he went back to Walden Pond to Concord for meals, for his mother to do his laundry. And some people criticize him for that. He was trying to live a simple life in the midst of outward civilization. He was known for leading huckleberry expeditions. He was part of skating. Ice skating was all the thing back then. He went to skating parties with people like Emerson and Hawthorne, and his daily walks were often with another companion. But back to the quote, seems to me it's a particularly good example of a touchstone passage, and here's why. Thoreau was writing about his own quest for touchstones, hoping that by reducing his daily life to its simplest terms, he might discover what his and life in general was all about. At the same time, he was certainly quite aware, and he was writing for an audience. He hoped. He was quite aware that his experiment might serve others who would be drawn into a similar quest by young Thoreau's declaration. Now, I've never lived for 2 years or even 2 days by the side of a pond in solitude, not at all, but I have lived with books by my side, many of them purporting to hold life wisdom, passages within books, touchstones against which I've measured my own experience, my own life. Thoreau did this too, and not only during those 2 years by Walden Pond. He was really quite a scholar, reading. Of course, if you went to Harvard, which he did, you had to read things in Latin and Greek. He and others of the Transcendentalists were reading some of the early translations of so-called Eastern texts, the Bhagavad Gita and others. But here's what he said, because he did read a lot by Walden Pond. Here's what he said in the 3rd chapter of Walden, which is titled Reading. He wrote, "My residence," meaning his cabin, "my residence was more favorable not only to thought, but to serious reading than a university. And though I was beyond the range of the ordinary circulating library, I had more than ever come within the influence of those books which circulate around the world." He meant, of course, the classics, and not only Greek and Roman, but those newly translated Hindu and Persian and Buddhist texts. And of all these sorts of texts, he wrote later in the same chapter, "By such a pile, we may hope to scale heaven at last." He went on, "There are probably words addressed to our condition exactly, which, if we could really hear and understand them, would be more salutary than the morning or the spring of our lives, and probably put a new aspect on the face of things for us." How many a person has dated a new era in his life, he didn't know about inclusive language, from the reading of a book. And this is precisely what I'm talking about today. Sometimes there's words that we read that are so powerful that they're life-changing for us. I expect you've had that experience. So this is not about, this morning, just sharing my touchstones. It's an invitation for you to reflect on your own. And it might not be a book or a quote. It might be a piece of music or a work of art that has somehow inspired you, touched you, moved you, given you a sense of what your life, of what life is all about, and may have dated a new era in your life at some point, as Thoreau said. Well, all this said, I want to share a few more tastes of my pages and pages, I've compiled them, of touchstone texts gathered over the decades, not through some grand ambition to compile this library of wisdom, but organically as passages or quotes came to me and have stayed with me. Emerson, within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. Or again, Thoreau, only that day dawns to which we are awake. Or Whitman, not exactly a transcendentalist, but similar, same era, who said, I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. Well, I can go on and on with passages from Whitman. Or from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And, as you heard, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And as I often remind my congregation, most religious language is metaphor. Translate heaven, translate God, however you will. There we go. Or from the East, so-called East, the Hindu Upanishads, perennial joy or passing pleasure, this